All right, welcome everybody. I'm glad everyone could join us here this evening, and also thank you to everyone who's joining us online. We are also very appreciative of your being here as well. Um, I'm Harris Phillips. I have the privilege of serving as the chairman of the Just Action team here at McFarlin, and most of you know this or have heard this before, but I will repeat it. That's the group of us who try to help facilitate, whatever the right word might be, this particular church and those that we have some influence over to live into what the United Methodist Church says in the Book of Discipline concerning racism, and that the church's official position is that we shall confront and seek to eliminate racism, whether in organizations or in individuals, and every facet of its life and in society at large. So pretty strong statement by the United Methodist Church, and we're trying to do just our little part of it as best we can. So we'll get started here in this event. I would ask Pastor Wendy to open us in prayer, if she would please, and then we will move along. Thank you.
Let us pray. Holy God, we give you thanks for this beautiful day and this opportunity to gather together to listen and to learn and to reflect on who you have made us to be and who you call us to be. And so, God, we pray that you would open our minds and our hearts and our ears. God, we give you thanks for David Wilson and his ministry to serve you, God, and to just share your love in this world. And so we are so grateful that he has given his time to be here, and we ask that you would bless him during this time as well. God, we lift all of this up in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
All right. Well, this evening we have the pleasure of having with us Reverend Dr. David Wilson. He is currently serving as the assistant to the bishop in the Oklahoma Indian Missionary Conference. He's a graduate of OCU, also holds a Master's of Divinity from Phillips Theological Seminary. And interestingly enough, he was actually the first clergy person from the OIMC to graduate from Phillips with a seminary degree. He also has an honorary doctorate degree from Bacone College. He does teaching, adjunct professor at OCU, and also adjunct professor at SMU in the Perkins School of Theology. So he is a man of knowledge and teaching, and it's with great pleasure that I introduce to you such a distinguished both pastor and educator to speak to us tonight. And so please join me in welcoming the Reverend Dr. David Wilson.
Appreciate that. Thank you much. It's good to be here at Norman and see some longtime friends and familiar faces. And I think from 95 to about 2007, I served at the pastor at Norman First American. And McFarlin was an integral part of helping us with so much, volunteer teams and funding and pulpit furniture and vans and all sorts of things. So got to know many folk here, and so it's good to be back here. When I went to the church, the superintendent at the time, I was on conference staff at the same time. Rockford knows how this goes. And the DS said, hey, they started the Wesley Foundation, and the Wesley Foundation OU is very busy. And so we outgrew it. And so and the lay pastor was there and he left. And after about 2 months. And so she said, we need someone to go fill in until we find somebody. 10 years later, Rockford, I left. She never bothered to look for anybody after that. So I learned that trick from the Reverend Dr. Lois Neal for that. But it's a great experience there at Norman First, and taught me much about life and about ministry. Trey asked if I'd be here tonight to talk about First Americans Museum and some of the history and my involvement, which goes back quite a ways before it began. When what they used to call the American Indian Cultural something museum. It was the group that got it together, and they officed on Broadway over in automobile alley. And so, of course, this is a long standing dream of Senator then Kelly Haney, and started in the early 90s of saying we need our own center. Kelly began introducing legislation to do that, great support. And then it got to a standstill when the governments changed, and so the funding stopped. And part of that had to do with many people's belief that the tribes are also very wealthy. They're not also very wealthy. We know a few who are. And so, like a lot of folk do, they said, let's let the tribes pay for that. And so it stopped and stuck. And so it'd go to the legislature and it'd be defeated, and the staff there in Broadway would be just distraught. So every time I stopped to see them, this was not my job, but many of these folk are longtime friends of mine. I'd stop and see them and have a prayer with them about 4 or 5 years in a row when they did that. And every time they'd be distraught, worked hard, all these folk who worked hard over this museum. And so when it finally, when the Chickasaw Nation stepped in and provided major funding to finish it, and it passed, I got to go see them. I said, I'm going to go see you one more time because this is a joyful time to get to celebrate with you for the work of this museum. Many of the staff members had left by then. There's only about 2 or 3 who've been with that project from day one, but when they share some of my involvement with what they do. This beautiful photo, this photo was taken from the grand opening. They taught me into chairing one of the committees, which was the Festival Plaza, and they had no idea what it's going to entail. Took years off of my life. And the most critical piece, which I did not pay attention to my calendar, Mr. Malden, was that later I found it was the same day we played Nebraska. And I very seldom miss OU games for anything but home. And I had to miss that game. My time was over, I thought I missed it for that. And so we spent weeks and weeks preparing for this. I got there in the morning. I was the first one there. I even beat security there and took this beautiful picture at sunrise of this building. This aerial view of the museum, and we'll talk about some of the architecture there and its meaning and symbolism. Beautiful place along the river, and just an amazing facility. Anytime I've been out there, I used to, when it first opened, I was there about once a week, and I would meet groups out there, introduce them, show them around, and familiar with so many of the people there for that get together. So I'm just love to history, love to learn. And for the longest time, I would tell people, 39 tribes in the state of Oklahoma, and I would say the Caddos and the Wichita, the only two, Daphne, somebody say this before, that are indigenous to Oklahoma. They were here long before the rest of the tribes. 37 other tribes were removed to Indian territory. And then I went to the museum, the curator said, no, that's not right true, because the Apaches and the Tonkawas also were somewhat indigenous, which means they came and went around here. And so they changed that for me. And then the Comanches, Kiowas, Osage, and Quapaw would also roam through the area on the piece. And then the Muskogee Creek and Seminoles were once assigned to that land where FAM is, and I did not know that. So I have to get used to this, the story for that. So diverse culturally, linguistically, of course, not in Oklahoma by choice. And after nearly 200 years, our histories and cultural lifeways are now interwoven into this landscape. This is our home, of course, for all of our tribes and that. So the museum sits along what is now the Oklahoma River. And eventually, I think it's part of Maps 4 for Oklahoma City, that if you've been to Oklahoma River, there's boats, tour boats that come up and down, boathouses, everything. Eventually, there'll be a stop at the river. At the museum. So you can be further down and then catch the boat and ride it to the museum, which is going to be cool. The bike trails don't come that far yet, but eventually they will also. So that's going to be cool. Crossroads of America. For thousands of years, Native people have built communities in alignment with the cardinal directions, and First American Museum has done that. A lot of Native thought that went into the construction of this building, where it's at, everything. It's just been amazing. And the wonderful, among the many wonderful things about this museum is that it was developed by Native American people. It doesn't happen too often, folks, around the country, where most often it's non-Native people who create and tell, and non-Native people who tell our story. And so now we have Native people there, amazing people, spent their lives of all ages doing this. So they are the people who will tell this story at the museum. So when you first come in, this started years ago, before there's a visitor center, and Bill Glass and his son Demos, they had a contest, or not a contest, but a competition where folk would submit their artwork for the entry to the museum, and this one's there. So this almost looks like the St. Louis arc and the hand and symbol in the middle. So when you first come in, when you go Saturday, unless you've been out there, you'll see this piece there. So in past, historians have often recorded that our people worship the sun. Almost all of our rituals today, except for the denominational church, began facing the east for that. It's in everything we do. Even our rural churches, the church Andrea came out of years ago in Creek Country, they all face the east, even then, if you ever visit. The only ones that don't are the urban churches, because of where we happen to be at. And so they believe we were worshiping the sun, but in fact, it was not sun worship, but to worship what was beyond the sun. The creator, it symbolizes prayer to the creator, symbolizes a zenith. In Cherokee, the creator resides in realm 7, zenith's high, much like the Genesis stories, the Bible, number 7 and 4 are very, that's a big piece of our culture for that. The cross symbolizes the sacred, number 4, found in the creator's order for the direction of the world. Season, stage of life, the logos of the stomp dance. So this beautiful piece that you'll see when you first enter into the museum, if you have not been out there for that. The remembrance walls, this one right here, you'll see the stone walls there. That was one of the very first pieces that came up that was built. The stones that compose these walls represent the indigenous peoples who have always called this land home. I think there may at least 10,000 stones there, and could be more. Also acknowledges our removal from our homelands throughout North America to Indian territory. So honors the lives of our people who are lost there. And those stones are thousands and thousands and thousands of years old. There, quarried in, I think, southeast Oklahoma, if I remember right. So the walls intentionally face the east to greet the morning sun, made of the stone. I can't pronounce his name, Potawatomi, distinguished warrior. And the name references the many colors highlighted at sunset and sunrise. So you'll see that after you pass the prayer piece, you'll see the stones as you come into the building there, on both sides of the entrance there. So the Hall of the People, you'll find all kinds of names. This will be the interior piece. I think this is what you'll see before you go into the exhibits. You'll pass through glass doors. Structure inspired by a Wichita grass lodge, pays tribute to the Wichita affiliated people who are among the original inhabitants there. So this is a great reminder when many folk who think all of us lived in teepees, and our housing was so different, so diverse around the country. You'll see this. This is the piece you see from the road, and folk who are not from Oklahoma always wonder what that is. This big beautiful piece that's there for that. So the exhibits are wonderful. I've taken so many groups out there, and I've yet to be able to spend a day out there just to check it out, to intently look at all the exhibits and what's been going on. Although I've been privy, even under construction, we get to go do tours out there, check it out. I did all kinds of immersion groups with St. Paul School of Theology and Perkins School of Theology, took them out there long before this was even ready, but they let us sneak in the basement, other places. I even did a wedding out there long before this was even done. And so this one piece, this is when you first come in, Oklahoma, of course, named after our state, home of the Red people. 39, it tells the stories of 39 tribes, 29 multimedia projects between the two exhibits, 60 Native community members who were interviewed during 2021, told from a first-person voice, and the whole team are members of tribes from Oklahoma. Some came on, and even while the museum is being on hold or being built, all this work is going on. I mean, they continued to do the research and develop the exhibits and all sorts of things. So that's what helped them once they knew it's getting closer to get this done for that. 14 specific films. It's just an amazing exhibit and only tells a story for the most part of Oklahoma tribes. There may be some others interjected, but that was intent, was to tell the stories of the 39 tribes in what is now Oklahoma. Over that. This upstairs is Winneco. This is an exhibit that was acquired by the Smithsonian, who's loaned it to the museum for, I don't even think they have a time frame on it. It was closed from January to March for cleaning, whatever they do to museums, cleaning the objects and all that, and just opened up about 2 weeks ago. So we lucked out to be able to have it open. A beautiful exhibit, second floor, all sorts of neat things in that project. So again, it tells you the quality of items, and they really have to work in conjunction with what the Smithsonian will let them do and not do with this exhibit for that. But this is another beautiful piece. This will be the outside of what the dome as you look at it from the west. And so you'll see the shape. If you looked at a traditional Wichita dwelling, this would be what it would look like, except it being grass dwelling there. This beautiful piece there. As we look at the outside of that. Again, the exhibits here. Daphne, these were taken during our last immersion that we had. We do an immersion every year, and I think we had about 35 people from all over the country who come. Spent the whole day out there. Some of those folk even who drove, they went back out there when it was over to continue to check it out. But some great exhibits there. This is the origin exhibit. When you first walk in to the main exhibit, you'll see this huge screen, and there are, I think, 3 or 4 origin stories that are told by different tribes. And I was telling, I forget who was talking about, but when I would teach biblical literature at OCU, we would look at the Genesis stories. So we'd pull out the Bible stories, and this is how old I am, and had to photocopy the stories out of wherever I could find them, Andrea. And then we compared those stories. What was different, what's the same. And we had a gathering of our indigenous pastors there in January. And this is Bishop Nunn's idea, and I really appreciate that. He said, he'd been out there several times with us as well. He said, what if we have a training for pastors? We get a chance to check out these origin stories, and then we get to have conversation about those similarities, differences. And it was a great, enriching time for us to do. You could teach a whole class out there at FAM to do that. But this will be beautiful. 4 stories, I think, animated. Even those who did the animation are native folk for that. So you'll see this contemporary piece. When you get toward the end, this van is a picture of a powwow van there, and big photos in the back. It's really neat, this contemporary piece of the museum that's there. One of the pieces that don't enjoy, but it's a very powerful place to be at, is a piece on stereotypes for Native American people there. And you'll see all these different caricatures that we all grew up with. And this one says, for many of us, our teaching simply asks us to do our best with what we have. First Americans face many social inequities.
I'm going to send this,
and
and then
despite
I'm going
these
to
challenges,
keep it, and I'm
we
going to
continue to creatively celebrate the beauty within our cultures. So when you go Saturday, whenever you happen to go, check it out, and you'll see many of these pieces that we grew up with, and myself as well for that. And it's a pretty good size exhibit on the stereotypes and who we happen to be for that. The mound for our eastern tribes, the 5 tribes and Kettles and others, the mounds have always been an important part of our culture. If you've been out to spiral mounds, old site, those mounds, which you would find everywhere in the eastern part of this country. That's where many of our creation stories begin. That's what many of our people say. That's where we originated. The Choctaw people were the same way. It's a place where we bury our dead. If you look at the indigenous cultures in South America, among the very same things. Some of you may have been to the Cahokia Mounds outside of St. Louis. So the mounds are very important. So when they began constructing this, the very first thing that came up that was created was on the left, the mound. And so you'll see that from the road. So when you're at the museum, you can start from below, and they just opened this. It's been under construction for some time. So you can start from the bottom or on the second floor, and you walk around. It's a pretty good sized distance. They also have chairs, wheelchairs if folks need them. And you get to the very end, and you're standing on the edge of Oklahoma City. Beautiful sight to see the edge of the city. And I think they've even already had a couple weddings out there on that site. A perfect site to be able to do that. The side on the right is it wasn't open, but the folks that our group and immersion sneak in, walk on the mound, check it out. There's also a couple places for silent reflection. And down below, there's a couple places for silent reflection. You listen to tribal stories or hymns. And so some folk can spend the whole day at the museum. Some folk run through them. However much time you need, it can be done out there. Just such a beautiful site there for that. This last piece I had to throw in there because this is news fresh off the press. Yesterday's press conference, I was on a Zoom call, and they said, we're at this meeting at First American Museum. Not like I think I know everything goes on out there every day, but I was curious. Big announcement from the tribes. And so they had professor at Oklahoma City University, I forget his last name, Chickasaw Choctaw. He does a lot of the studies for the tribes and for others. And so he's been working on this for some time. And the tribes announced this $15 billion impact upon the state of Oklahoma in 2019. I share that story because last night I was with the familiar group. It was a group of women from First Presbyterian in Stillwater, except we're on Zoom. And it's a group of women like you who are looking at how they work around the injustices of the world. And they sought to learn about Native folk. And so we had this great conversation. And I share with them about, for many of our people, how we're often overlooked, except for the song and dance. I tell people often when I'm invited places, or they call my office, they want singers or dancers. And people forget how diverse we are, how talented we are. I mean, we're in every sphere of this country, if not this state. And even for myself, when I bring groups, Daphne knows this, others know this, I can point out the Native influence everywhere in this city and across the state. Wake up every morning, to the east, I see the beautiful sculpture on top of this U.S. State Capitol that Kelly Haney did. It'll be there for years and years and years. So this $15 billion impact that the tribes have had upon the state of Oklahoma, and they shared that because they also share that this story is not just about how we take care of ourselves, but how we are good neighbors to the entire state of Oklahoma. And that intertwines with what we're doing because it talks about who we are and our common themes of taking care of community and the importance of relationships for our people there. And I think that's my last slide. So time for questions and responses, which is always the funnest part for some anyway. Yeah. Yes. Mm-hmm. There are every weekend there's something at that place. And their intent is to focus on various tribes and their culture throughout every weekend. So for instance, well, right now out there is there's a play written by Native folk, starring Native folk, I forget the name. But so that's going on, started Tuesday through Sunday. Big crowds every night, sponsored by Lyric Theater. And so in the weekend before, or 2 weekends before, they had stickball exhibitions, several Eastern tribes, dancers, performances. Every weekend there's something out there. Not so much during the week, which may change for the summer, but for now, they're really working hard to showcase that. The challenge is, of course, we got plenty of time, but showcasing 39 tribes across the state. But it also helps folks to see how diverse we are. The Western tribes who don't dance like the Chickasaws, which is what most of us are used to there, but that's a beautiful place. And the other thing the museum does, most of the tribes in the state have a museum. Choctaw Nation, my tribe, just opened one Beautiful, beautiful museum. I say that from photos, haven't been out there yet. Chickasaws, Muskogee Creeks have one, Cherokees have the Heritage Center, even the smaller tribes do. So they hope that when people come to the First Americans, it'll draw interest in folks to go back to these places where they come from and to check out the history and culture of those places there. A good question. Thank you. Thank you for that. Yes. You said you weren't going to ask me that during the session. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. You know, I was coming home. My mother lives outside Muskogee and always had business. So I take care of business on the way and stopped in Okmulgee, the home of the Muskogee Creek Nation. And they have a billboard and it's a running board. And I stopped and it said, prayers for the people of Ukraine. And I had to pull over, take a photo there. Our folk who understand what it means to have your land invaded, all of that. So our folk are very much supporting what's happening there. Churches raising funds, tribes I know sending money to do what they can to help out the people there. Yeah, understanding that. Thank you. That wasn't too hard of a question, so thank you. Wendy?
Said several times about sharing the creation story and Genesis with some of the creation stories of the tribe. Give us a mini brief class that you might.
Oh yeah, I'd love to. I'll pull up another PowerPoint if you want to do that. No, you know, part of what I tell people, you know, the purpose of creation stories is figure out where do we come from? How did we get here? That's what Genesis does. Well, how do we come into being? And if you read the Genesis stories, for instance, one story male and female is created together. One story man's first, women's first, and it talks about the animals and the birds. But most of our creation stories, the animals and birds are created. They're there, they're present. And then here comes human being in those stories. And for many of these creation stories, for instance, the Choctaw people were in a mound, the Caddo people were in a mound, and they're searching for light. And then they see a sliver of light come in and people begin to go out finding this light. So I share that in terms of the light of the Genesis stories, of what people look for, searching for light, searching for goodness. And for most of our creation stories, the interaction of all of humanity. You know, relationships are very, very important to us, but not just human relationships. It's our relationship with the animals, the two-leggeds, with the winged ones. When I travel up north, now Oklahoma tribes, Andrew may or may not agree with me. You know, we are so colonized and Christianized. Many of us have gone away from that. Unless you go to the boonies and Creek Country and other places, it's different. But if you're around here, we've adjusted. But when I go up to Standing Rock, which I'm there about twice a year, they'll tell me, wonderful. The very first time we went for the Standing Rock for the pipeline, they were telling me the creation story of the Lakota people. The pinpoint where they began, where I believe it began in the Black Hills, and how for them, they observe when the rocks cry out. And I said, oh, you know what I'm thinking? I'm thinking about the biblical story of that. And so that's in our ceremonies, this relationship we have with Mother Earth and with animals. And so we can see that. So those are some of the big pieces that we talk about, how these stories are sometimes more alike than they are different for that. And for the creation stories, for tribal stories, often some animosity in the beginning, but folk, animals, and humans who learn to get along and live together. And you'll find that Saturday. Please make sure you check out. I think there's 4 of those, so make sure you check those out and know the people who created those, and they're beautiful. So thank you. Other questions, comments? Yes, Ann. I can, yes. Well, it's a good question. Thank you. Sure, thank you. Thank you for that. I knew I wanted to do this piece first, so that's why I held out for that. Today the Oklahoma Indian Missionary Conference has about 81 churches around the state, mostly on the eastern side, Choctaws, Muskogee Creeks, and in the eastern part of the state. Very, very rural, and our challenge there is as our young people leave those areas, they move to towns and cities looking for job opportunities. OU, many of you connect with OU. I think they're number 2 in the country, number 3 for the most Native American students of any in the country. The first is Pembroke, North Carolina, among the Lumbee people. Number 2 is Northeastern State University at Tahlequah, which makes sense among the Cherokees, and I think OU is number 3. So many of our people, when the Norman First Church first came to reality, became from young people raising families who got tired of driving back home to the local church, to the native church, and so they built it. But they created a church here, and all of them are very connected with the university. So again, it shows that piece, and so that's where our future lies in terms of the ministries. But even those small membership churches, many, all of our churches, if you attended, use our tribal language, especially in music. Have a handful of our pastors who are still bilingual. So some of the very rural churches would have most of their services in the tribal language, and it goes back and forth because folks can do that. So we're continue to get after it. Even in COVID, folks learn to adjust, and have to remember in the rural areas, Southeast Oklahoma, they have very little internet access out there. I was even in Broken Bow, Oklahoma, coming through. We were down there for a work project and couldn't get internet. And the big town in Broken Bow, Oklahoma, I said, man, if Broken Bow can't get it, then nobody can get it. And so that made it difficult when COVID hit, had to go online. Most folks couldn't do that. And so you just had to make do with what you can make do with, and some did, and some couldn't, and yet they persevered. I lost many of our people during COVID early on. Our people are very intergenerational. I tell people, a lot of folk, maybe you, when your kids get to college, you say, good, they're down the road, or they're out of the house, we can go on and do our thing. Our kids don't leave home. They're there. And so there may be, during COVID, there'd be grandparents, parents, grandkids in the same house. Among the Navajo people who are hit very hard early on, very intergenerational, way out in the boonies, if you've been out to Arizona, New Mexico, Utah. And so one person goes out, comes home, the whole house is affected. So they had a huge loss of life early on. And then when the tribes first started getting vaccines, they really buckled down. And the Navajos early on had like a 75% rate of people vaccinated. But they learned because of the loss that they had. And Oklahoma tribes did the same thing. Our churches worked for those. And many of you know when early on for COVID, when we were trying to do the vaccinations, they weren't available. Once the tribe vaccinated their own people, they opened it for everybody. We partnered with the Cheyenne Arapaho tribe at Mosaic United Methodist, and we did like 1,400 immunizations in like a 4 or 5 month period. It was amazing to see non-native people being treated so well by the tribes, which reminds us, we tell people often, is our thought is not just about ourselves, it's about the entire community there. But for the most part, churches doing well, even the small ones hanging in there. We're one of the only conference in the South Central jurisdiction that pays 100% of their general church apportionments. And I think this year we're one of 8. We've done that for years and years and years because we recognize the contributions we get from the general church and our need to pay back and do our part for that. And the same for McFarlin, for your great support through your mission and ministry dollars that come back to help us out. We greatly appreciate that. Thank you. Good question. Thank you. Yes, sir. Yeah, if you're in the Muskogee Creek, Choctaw area, there'll be mostly those tribes. Urban areas are very intertribal. So the Angie Smith Church might have as many as 12 tribes represented. Mary Clark and Del City, as many as 10. Predominantly Choctaw, predominantly Choctaws at both places, but many tribes who are part of that. And so if you're at an urban, Norman First might be 10, 12 tribes. So on a Sunday morning, they'll have a section for tribal hymns. Might have 5 or 6 hymns that people will sing. And it's not as formal as other churches, perhaps as McFarlin would be. But there's a point, one person will start singing the song. When they finish, somebody just jumps in and just continues that cycle of singing songs till everybody's done. And the beautiful hymns and our annual conference, because our churches have been amongst each other so long, we all know each other's songs. So we can sing Kiowa Creek, you name it, except for Navajo, because they're not a part of OMC, but we know each other's songs. And So the annual conference session is a beautiful place to hear those hymns for that. Yeah. Yeah. Good question. Thank you. Yes. I think you're just allowed one question, but I'll let you, I'll give you two. Oh, man. When I think about Angie DeBow, I think about my friend, Robert Henry. Robert was president of LCU and loved Angie DeBow. And Robert was always one that just loved to listen to her stories, but her book, And Still the Waters Run, amazing book that tells of the history. Really, she tells a lot about my hometown in Muskogee. I knew all those names growing up. And she tells us, the story of how Oklahoma was created and how the tribes were, messed around and done right. And there's a wonderful, it's an old OETA special comes on every so often. And, the narrator talks about how she was, she couldn't find a job anywhere when she did that book and the rest. But amazing woman who really told it like it was, trailblazer, certainly for her time, when you think about it. Yeah, I love her book and have one of my books. I keep at home. And when folk ask me what to read, I'll always say, share that one. I'm at the state capitol, see her beautiful portrait there. And Robert always still does wonderful stories about her life. Yeah, thank you. Yes. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah, there's several. And I think there's a piece at the museum that the question was, are there still languages that are about to be extinct? And there's several, like the tribes in the Northeast near Miami, they might have one or two speakers left. And so the tribes are working really hard, especially the big tribes, because they have more resources. So they're developing phone apps. They're still doing classes in the community. And many of our churches, especially Muskogee Creek and Choctaw, many of our pastors teach those classes. So they have classes in the local church and the tribe supports them. The tribe trains them. And so, but for instance, Choctaw Nation, every day we get the word of the day, a phrase of the day, and we listen to it and try to learn it. And so tribes are really putting a lot of effort back into language. For that, which that's challenging for us, because when we stop and think about OMC, that was one of the projects of the church, was to make us speak English. And to the boarding school experience, which is another presentation in itself. And there's a good piece at the boarding school at the museum. And so now what, the church sought to take that away from us. And now folks are fighting hard to maintain that. When my father was a full-blood Choctaw, spoke and never taught his kids, and his two brothers never did. And the only time I heard him speak Choctaw was at our church. There's two other women there, full-blood Choctaws, who did the same thing, never taught their children. And that's the only time I would hear him speaking Choctaw, unless his dad came over, his brothers came over. And so often the church is a place where folks get to do it. I was at a Kiowa church a while back, woman, 92, and fluent speaker. And one of her friends came one day about the same age, and they about cried when they saw each other. And the whole time they just spoke Kiowa. That was it. We left them alone. They spoke to each other the whole time, because they never get to do that. There's so few speakers left, and they just love that very much. OU teaches probably 3 or 4 languages. Northeastern will teach Cherokee. All the bigger tribes really focusing on that. Norman also has a language fair every year. It's either, I think, coming up in April. And so they'll have, maybe 14 or 15 tribes, and the kids will come up and do music or plays, something creative around language. And so folk are working hard on that. Thank you for that. Yes. Not near as big. The next biggest area that we have for Indian Methodist churches among the Lumbee people in North Carolina. There's about 12 churches there in mostly Robeson County. And then the Navajo people used to have a large gathering, their situation is different because on reservations, churches can't own land. And the Navajo learned that the hard way. That's why they had to create these rules. So churches can't own land, so you meet in people's houses. And so of course, when those people get mad at you, whatever, you're down the road. So they may have three or four churches left. They're reorganizing. And I asked the chancellor, I said, by the way, how many churches are left? He said, we have no idea. And the last time I checked, it was just 3 or 4. And then the rest are intermittent, one in Anaheim, Michigan, New York. And many of these churches, in the early days when our parents went to school, they would go and teach in BIA schools, and they would create these churches. Church in Anaheim was created by the Reverend Dr. Lois Neal and her late husband. Yuma, Arizona, they started that church. Michigan, Kiowa pastors were there, started those churches. Mississippi, and so we have a great influence around the country for these Indian Methodist churches for that. Very few left. There's probably 100 and we have 81. There's probably about 110, if that many left around the country. And the challenge is, even for us, and should address this, Ann, is that the search for leadership, for our full-time pastors with even with the master's degree, your salary is about $34,000. When I tell people for Rockford, when I was in seminary finishing at Phillips, doing a church at Tahlequah, campus ministry at Northeastern. And when I finished my master's degree at Phillips, I was making $15,000. And I look back and thought, boy, I was silly to do that. Of course, my family's all around, big family, people took care of me. Even now when I go home to see my mom, she thinks I'm a poor preacher. She still tries to give me money, send food home with me. Every time I go, she'll say, here's you some lunch money, whatever, gas money. And she still does that to me every time I go home. So I don't tell her I'm coming, so she won't be trying to get money. She goes to her cabinets, see what she can send home with me. She still thinks I'm that poor preacher guy for that. So you think about that. So you say, go get undergrad, go get 3 or 4 years of seminary. And when you get down, we'll pay you $34,000. If you're a young pastor, you cannot do that. Imagine for yourself and Carlos and doing that. And that's the case for most of our Indian Methodist churches around the country. So many are supplied today by non-native pastors, except for OMC. We have about 98% of our pastors are native. I think 2 serving from Oklahoma. They do church in Oklahoma and in OMC. But most of our other pastors and outside of OMC are served by non-native folk. And many are using lay pastors because they simply can't afford to do that. And irony, here's the irony of this. I shouldn't tell you this because you probably observed Native American Sunday. Half of that, some of that money goes back for scholarships for Native students. There's probably $400,000 or $500,000 in that account. And I'm on the committee. We award about 2 a year because no one's willing to take that step to do that. And so I'm working with once we ever get general conference, we have some legislation to be able to have some leeway with that money. It's very tight. Has to be used for Native persons going to seminary, and that's it. And so we're trying to change that language so we can use it for leadership and some other pieces. So that's probably the biggest challenge for OMC. Cabinet was today, Rockford. So I'm surprised I'm here after a cabinet day. Those are always grueling. And that'll be our challenge in April. We'll have 3 or 4 churches open and not enough people to fill that. Yeah. We do. We have shared. Matter of fact, I think we have 2 right now that we share. Mayor Irby, and we're sharing one for North Texas, although he just joined. North Texas, our biggest church is in Dallas, Texas, and JB Jackson, who just moved to OMC, and then hosting conference is a missionary who I met years ago at Redbird. He's been here 15 years. And I know there's another Oklahoma conference pastor. I can't think who it is, but we have at least 2 every year. Yeah, and we know most, been around long enough, know most of the folk, and that's a big help for us too. And we have a couple of pastors who are serving Oklahoma conference churches and ours. So the DSs will say, who do you have? That's what we all do. We'll say, who do you have and what do you have open? So they'll start calling and text me about right now, and we'll check in to see what's going on. Yeah, so that's a good relationship there. We've been very fortunate for Bishop Nunn, been very gracious toward us and understanding who we are, learning who we are, going with the flow, and relies upon our leadership greatly. Of course, most of his time is spent in Oklahoma, and that's because of the number of churches you have compared to ours, but he's been good for that and really affirming our culture and being cautious about people we place in our churches for non-native. Understand that. Yeah. Appreciate him very much. Yeah. That about it? Yeah. Sure. Okay. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. You know, when government and the church first began to evangelize among the eastern tribes, you know, that what happened in southeastern part of the country, they saw the beautiful land we had. And then what really was the kicker, they discovered gold in Georgia. And the tribes had great relationship with the people there, the eastern tribes at least. You know, eastern tribes were agriculturalists, so we in that land for years and years and years. If you're up north, those tribes want, you know, not roam, but they followed the buffalo for the existence, and so there were not many people in that part of the country, the first immigrants, unlike the eastern part of the country, and so tribes quickly adopt their ways, and you know, they had good relationships with the president of the United States, traveled back and forth, but yet when the gold was discovered and people wanted that land, and Choctaws first, Cherokees next, being sent to Indian Territory, the government said, what are we going to do with this quote unquote Indian problem? And so they, first of all, you have to become Christian, become civilized when you have it, and learn English. And so therefore, the boarding schools began, but the Chickasaws and Choctaws, you know, education was always important. So when we were removed, the tribes created their own schools. And so they were not schools where we were sent off to, they were in our communities. And that's what made them more successful, although they're not all you know, free of what's going on. And so many of my people, like our parents, grandparents, who looked ahead to the future and said, what good will this tribal language be in the future? And that's what many of our parents did. My father, his brothers, and so many folks my age, we shared that same story and wished it had been different. And because that was the way of the church, and they were part of the church. My father's family, Cumberland Presbyterian, and even my mother's side was both Cumberland Presbyterian, Cherokee and Choctaw. And so we, you know, got into it. So many Oklahoma natives are part of the Christian church. So when I travel up north, they're not very crazy about Christian folk. Think about the Lakota people and all that, those experiences that they had. And so when we first went up to Standing Rock years ago, I had friends I'd met years ago and found them and connected with them. But they're not crazy about Christian people there. And they often ask that question and say, because of what the church did to our people, how can you be a Christian? And so they ask us that question often. And for those of us like myself, that's all we know. And we do our best to live by Christian principles, and especially how we live it out. I mean, that's what we try to model when we go to other Native communities. It's not by what we teach, but how do we live our lives? You know, when we go up to Standing Rock, we'll take school supplies, we take Christmas. We don't have to talk about Christ. We just have to talk about, they know we're part of the church and that we represent that. And not all folk do that. I mean, the early days was evangelize and we're heathens, we're pagans, and we still get that in certain parts of the country. Native folk do. So I can see why folk are, you know, not happy with Christianity. And so it's a big, outside of Oklahoma, which is a totally different dynamic than anywhere. And I've traveled a lot across Indian country in this country and around the world. But it's so different because, you know, when our people first came here, the Cherokees and Choctaws, they brought Christianity with them. I have to remind folk, Rockford, from time to time in the Oklahoma conference, that OMC is the mother church of Methodism for this state. We've been here since the 1820s, and then other folk came later. They might act like they run the show, but we're the mother church of Methodism, and we're proud of that. Proud of that heritage, and our churches try hard to live out their faith through the churches and how we do outreach to our communities. With that, so good question. That's another long session in itself. See what I mean? We could do a whole semester. Some people like Mr. Molden may not make it, but the rest of you can make it. He'd have to sit in the back. So thank you for that. Any other questions or comments? I appreciate your time tonight. Always enjoy sharing and about our culture and of course, museum, the conference. It's so not complicated, so what the word I'm looking for, vast, and it maybe it is complicated, Andrew, our lives, but it's a certain degree who we are, our history.
I have one question. Bonus shares here went up to the museum about a month
Mhm.
ago. And of course, one of the main things was to eat.
Yes.
So
Mhm.
we didn't spend as much time, we'll have to go back.
Mhm.
But I didn't see anything about the Choctaw Code Talkers in
Ah.
World War I. Are they in the museum?
Yeah, they are. They're toward, as when you come almost the bottom floor, when you come almost out toward the very end, you'll see them. There'll be not just Choctaw, but several tribes are there. I tell the story. We're doing a big voter initiative to get Native folk registered to vote. And 1924, June 2nd, we're doing some big events. That was the Indian Citizenship Day, when our people became citizens of this country. My grandfather, who's a Choctaw code talker, and I said I think about this. He served in the war long before he was a U.S. citizen, and if it wasn't for those Choctaw men using the code in France, that war might have been different. And people, per capita, and the exhibit should say this, per capita, we have served in more wars and military than anybody else in this country. And people say, how in the world can that be? Again, given what the country's done to you. And I said, this is still our land, still our place. We're still going to defend it. And even today, in our churches, there's always debate about that. Almost all of our Indian churches, on Veterans Day, there's a big celebration. Anyone who's a veteran in that place will be recognized. If you get to Norman first, as a matter of fact, they're having a fundraiser, I think a week from Saturday, the Wild Onion Dinner there. And so there's a staff on the wall, it's eagle feathers. When the Gulf War started, there was the first person who was killed was a Hopi woman, Lori Piestawal. And one of our members, who was a veteran, now he's deceased, he said, we're going to put an eagle feather up there for every one of these, our people who go to war. And when they come home, we'll give it back to them. Of course, she never came home, so her feather still stands. But all of our folk in that church who've gone off to war, they come home, we have a big ceremony, and they get an eagle feather. Up north, when they come home from the airport, whole tribe will show up, do a ceremony right there in the airport to recognize those people home, men and women, because we're so proud of who they are, what they do. So our folk are very, very, very patriotic all over. So yeah, if you get a chance, it's there. His photo's not in there. I looked, but there's several tribes represented, but we're very proud of my grandfather and our legacy for that. Yeah, yeah, thank you. Yes, they have. Yeah. Yeah, the United for Oklahoma does the wonderful story. And if you notice what they're doing, they're trying to help folks. They're trying to tell our history and the impact we made upon Oklahoma and the country. They do amazing work. I'm working with them now too with our stuff, but they do love the work they do. Yeah. Yeah. And every time I watch those, I can tell you all the Methodist people in those, every one of those, and Chickasaw, so many of those folk are Methodists. So the great impact we've had around the state, we're very, very proud of for that. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Oh, yeah. Mhm. Yeah. 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 A big time, because our Choctaw newspaper and the whole issue is about, I mean, you don't get a single paper. We're not building a clinic or millions of dollars for education, building community centers, and just in everyone's like that. We, a lot of the local small towns, almost all the big tribes help pay for their fire equipment, police cars, you name it, right and left. Chickasaw Nation, who very good to the Oklahoma Indian Missionary Conference, they have contributed probably $800,000 to our permanent endowment. So we'll have a big gala coming up in I think April 21st, and they pay for the meal, and so everything we make is clear profit, and so they're that good to us. Muskogee Creek people will buy vans for the churches. They do church repair. There's no separation of church and state in Indian country. there's not Andrea can tell you, I'm invited so often to government native events, and they'll say, can you come pray? You would not see that among the non-native community, but we don't separate that. It's part of our holistic life of who we are. Same with all of that. So yeah, thank you for that. Cherokees do that. Choctaws do that. The tribes who have more money are very good to the communities because they have it. Smaller tribes, Ponca tribe, Kiowas, others, they don't have near as much money as others do, but they do a lot for the community. But the bigger tribes do so much for that, especially because you're in the boundaries of the Chickasaw Nation or almost. So they're so good to the state. Yeah. Anyone else? Good. Well, I'm going to say thank you again for being here. I look forward to being here tonight, and I see some longtime friends and the great work that you do here at McFarlin. And when this place was first built, I was sharing, actually the first one we had a Walt Onion dinner was upstairs somewhere before this is built. We had like 3 or 4 places we rented, and we didn't have a space big enough. We're upstairs over here, and then we got to use this building and used it for several times, because your church has been so good to Norman First American and to OMC, and we appreciate that very, very much. Great fond memories, pastors, and just talk about McFarlin. Always know all kinds of folk over here. So thank you for that. Appreciate your time. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Reverend Dr. Wilson. What a fantastic time. Just if I could come up with more questions, I'd want for you to talk for another hour, but yeah. Thank you very much. I wouldn't miss an opportunity to put in a plug for some of the things that the Just Action team going on. There's nothing more that I could possibly say about the First Americans Museum other than to remind everybody that the trip sponsored by the Just Action team is this Saturday at 1:45. If you want to go, you can sign up. There's a paper sign up. You can also go to the website, the church's website, and sign up there. And if you can also email Pastor Wendy if those other things don't work for you. We do have transportation. There'll be a church van for those people who want to go that way as opposed to taking yourselves. We want to try to make that happen for as many people as are available to do it. If not, I'm sure you'll go some other time. I know listening to you talk about it, it's got me very excited about going. I would just also mention that some of the details on these other 2 things have not yet come together, but I just put this out there to you. We plan to have some summer book studies. Not sure exactly what the books will be or exactly what the timing will be, other than in June and July. And when that comes together, we'll publicize that. So we hope that you find something there that's beneficial to you. And I would also say that this over the late winter, we did a study of the Dream Clock, Dr. Clarence Hill's, Reverend Dr. Clarence Hill's Dream Clock study here. And we hope to do that again in some fashion, some later in the year, as we kind of figure out how the best time and place for that. So if that's something you're interested in, just keep a lookout for that. I won't hold you any longer. I got my plugs in. Thank you for everyone coming out. Thank you to everyone who also joined us online. I wish you all a good evening.